Good morning, MGM, and all of you. Just doing things correctly. So, Chancellor Kadam, Vice Chancellor Sabka, dear colleagues, dear students, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here again, second time actually, in 10 years, less than 10 years. Before the pandemic, actually, I was here. But this time, the flavor is different. And I will tell you why I will start from there. Actually, the theme of this conference, Nonviolence Without Borders, is a movement that I initiated with a couple of friends around the world a year ago. And so we have Canadians, we have Armenians, now we have some projects in Latin America with some Colombians, and also, of course, Indians. So it's very dear to my heart to talk about something that we are also practicing it on an everyday basis. And this brings me to the subject today. I don't know, as you saw, actually our timing has changed in this program, so I will go on with my lecture, but you can always stop me if I talk too long. I never like to talk too long. So the question that I want to ask is how we can think about nonviolence in today's world, and I think that this is a question which is difficult to answer, of course, especially in the current global context where violence dominates our everyday life. But when we look at the past 100 years behind us, this 100 years, this 1 century has left us with a double legacy. On the one hand, it has been a time of great violence and cruelty represented by the 2 world wars. It has been represented by the Holocaust, it has been represented by the use of the atomic bomb against Japan, a great number of genocides and ethnic cleansings in Rwanda, in Cambodia, in ex-Yugoslavia. But on the other hand, we have seen different manifestations of tolerance, compassion, forgiveness, reconciliation, civil existence, and nonviolence. And these were demonstrated and experienced by moral and political figures like Mahatma Gandhi, before everyone else, Martin Luther King Jr., Khan Abdul Khan, to talk about the Muslim, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, Václav Havel, and of course many others. I left out Cory Aquino and many others. So many of these figures that I mentioned, they believed fundamentally that nonviolence is embedded in our nature as human beings. And I go back to my quote from Gandhi, actually, who said that nonviolence is the law of our species. Nonviolence may be embedded in our nature, as Gandhi says, but it seems to be rarely practiced in everyday social relations and political institution building. And this is partly due to the fact that many around the world consider nonviolence as the absence of violence, in the same way that they think of peacemaking as the absence of war making. There is more to peacemaking than just stopping wars, and there is more to nonviolence than not practicing violence. If you don't beat up your wife or your children, you're not necessarily a nonviolent person. You've done a good job not doing it, but it's not necessarily that you're a nonviolent person. But there are, I think they are unaware of the fact that nonviolence, as it was practiced by individuals like Gandhi and MLK Jr., was neither a form of passive resistance, as they repeated it many times, against the evil, nor a simple dynamic of resistance against tyranny. I think it would be wrong to look at nonviolence as a moral abstraction, or just as a set of tactics, as somebody like Jim Sharp does it, and pragmatics actually, they think in these terms. Even if we can use nonviolence as a strategy to fight injustice, what the experience of nonviolent movements in the 20th century show us is that nonviolent action is always accompanied by a process of change and transformation in values and in action. And I would underline values, because this is very important. Actually, in one of my books, the title of one of my books actually on Martin Luther King Jr. is called Revolution of Values, which Martin Luther King himself talks about. Actually, it's a word by Martin Luther King. We need to make a revolution of values in our world. Otherwise, even in ecology that Professor Desardo was talking about, if we don't change our values on an everyday basis, we cannot change the world, and there's no way of wasting our time. So the reason is simple. Nonviolent action is, I would call it, not a sprint, but a marathon. So if you're a sprint runner, don't get involved with nonviolence. You have to be a marathon runner, because it needs long distance runners who can make it to the finishing line. And sometimes it takes years, and it takes centuries. It takes a long time, actually. So, and this element of what the French call longue durée is represented by the transformation of the self and the other in the process of a new approach to the concept of power. The genius of a nonviolent leader like Gandhi, we are actually celebrating his birthday on the 2nd here in Aurangabad, was in transforming political power from an end to a means for ethical transformation of the society. And that is why Gandhi, like Henry David Thoreau and Leo Tolstoy, he saw nonviolence as a work of civil society and not the state. All these revolutions I talked about, all these transformations were done by civic actors, okay, and not by the states. Very rarely a state represents nonviolence. Maybe we have moral leaders like Mandela who become presidents of the states later on, but when they start, they are not members of the state, they are members of the civil society. And that's very, very important. I think the Germans who are sitting there, they understood it quite well, because they practiced that at the level of their civil society in many levels. So Gandhi's insight was that the power of nonviolence would be expressed more by an ethical and self-disciplined citizenry than by a self-centered state that acts through coercive power. And there was no ambiguity in Gandhi's mind that there is no such thing as an armchair nonviolent resistance. If you want to sit down and not do anything and just talk about, like the politicians do in India and elsewhere, talk only about Gandhi and nonviolence without doing anything, it's better that you don't do it. Because we don't have, as Albert Camus said, we don't have armchair philosophers. I say we don't have armchair nonviolent thinkers and activists. There is no such thing as that. So in other words, an individual who does not actively participate in the public space cannot be counted as a practitioner of nonviolence. And in that sense, we could say that nonviolent action is the direct consequence of the political promise inherent in human plurality. If we define politics, like Hannah Arendt, as the human ability to act in concert, we could say that while violence has an anti-political essence, nonviolence is a legitimate form of political action. I hope that some of your students sitting in this room, they are not like the students at Jindal and they go and read Hannah Arendt and they read books. I invite you to read more and more books to understand things. However, in Gandhi's design of nonviolent action, it is not freedom, as in the Arendtian meaning of politics, but the empowerment of the weakest, which plays the central role, as you know. For both Gandhi and King, nonviolence as empowerment of the powerless functions only if there is primacy of the ethical over the political. And I think that we have to repeat that all the time. All of us who have been working, I've been working on Gandhi for the past 30 years of my life. We have to repeat that all the time. Primacy of the ethical over the political. Don't let the political have the primacy over the ethical. So throughout his life, Mahatma Gandhi was confronted with the question of relationship between ethics and politics, and his goal and his attempts were to reconcile in his life as a political leader, but also in the realm of mass nonviolent struggle, the demands of ethical principles with the reality of political power. And as such, I think that what Gandhi was and what Gandhi did was the opposite of what was declared by the basic theorists of political realism, starting with Sun Tzu, the Art of War, and ending with Jean-Paul Sartre, actually, with the introduction that he wrote to Fanon. They all believe that one cannot participate in politics without being prepared to have dirty one's hands. This is actually a play by Sartre, Le Mans Sartre. And even if you go further and we'll read Max Weber, maybe Max Weber is taught in this university by some professor. If you go and read the profession and vocation of politics, Max Weber actually, I quote him, he says, anyone seeking to save his own soul and the soul of others does not take the path of politics in order to reach his goal, for politics has quite different tasks, namely those which can only be achieved by force. I think both Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. proved that one can be politically engaged in the public realm without necessarily being interested either in power or practicing a coercive force. Gandhi was very clear about not mixing nonviolent action and power politics. He insisted that the politician in him had never dominated a single decision of his. So what Gandhi and King shared, and they showed us, is that a successful nonviolent resistance needs a moral leadership rather than only a political agenda. Let me tell you immediately that what we are lacking today around the world, including Europe, including America, including Southeast Asia, is the absence of moral leaders. We have a lot of political leaders all over the world, starting from Mr. Macron, going to the Italian fascist government, but we don't have moral leaders. Ending with India, no moral leaders. Only people who are thinking in terms of money and power, all over. So that's what's actually lacking. I mean, we have to be very frank. We cannot change our world with this kind of leaders. Why do we actually try to fake things? And this is because a nonviolent activist or a satyagrahi or a leader of nonviolent cause has to be it's not a political moralist. And we're talking about ethics, which has a primacy once again. Gandhi was not a realist politician. He called himself a practical idealist. He never called himself a realist politician who used moral language as an instrument of power politics. On the contrary, he was a moral politician. I think not a realist politician, a moral politician who conceived the principles of politics in such a way that they could coexist with morality. And that's why he thought of himself as a practical idealist, as I said, meaning a person who draws his inspirations from moral principles. So for Gandhi, the satyagraha strategy presupposes a permanent and unconditional application of ethics of ahimsa and respect for life. This is where the ecological imperatives that Professor Sharma, Professor Desara, and many others are going to talk about comes from. Also, Gandhi embraced the belief in truth while he preached and applied an ability to self-discipline, self-restraint, and self-sacrifice. Actually, for those of you who know your political theory, Gandhi's theory of politics is exactly the opposite of Hobbesian state. Hobbes talks about self-preservation, Gandhi talks about self-sacrifice. And self-sacrifice is because of the otherness of the other. You're thinking of the other. That other can be a human being or an animal or a plant. But this self-sacrifice is not only about self-centered self-preservation. So Gandhi embraced this self-sacrifice and self-restraint. But we can say that in a way Gandhi was a situationist because He chose different techniques of nonviolence depending on the situation he was faced with. And we can see it with his fast, and we can see it with his, I think, glorious moment in Chori Chora when he stops a civic movement just because this civic movement is becoming very immoral and is becoming violent. How many politicians you know in today's world which will stop a movement? They will not. So actually Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence as a principal form of civil resistance can be summed up in three interconnected arguments against violence. First of all, howsoever urgent the need for violence, violence is neither pragmatic nor productive. This is the first point. Secondly, rejection of violence originates in an epistemological argument on the nature of truth. And thirdly, rejection of violence is ontological. In this sense, any act that causes harm to others injures me as well. I insist on this ontological aspect because it's about the self and the other. You cannot think of yourself without thinking about the other. Okay? More significantly, what Gandhi was saying is that the attainment of nonviolence requires an enormous amount of moral courage and commitment to the truth, and above all, a system of public ethics. It demands collective efforts, it demands collective transformation. In other words, what I'm saying is, unlike violent struggle, nonviolent struggle educates. Education is a self-education. It's what the Germans call Bildung. It's a form of Bildung. You form yourself, actually. It motivates you, it transforms citizens. And that is why Gandhi and King both distinguish satyagraha from other forms of civil disobedience. For both of them, satyagraha calls for tremendous moral strength, which is absent in other forms of struggle against injustice. As a matter of fact, satyagraha is a theory of action in which the agent should become aware of the distinction between rights and wrongs and should become sensitized to the need to fight for justice against the abuse of power. I remember that Desmond Tutu, during the apartheid, on the wall of his house was written how to transform wrongs into rights. And he was one of the people who actually tried to transform wrongs of South Africa into the rights of South Africa after apartheid regime. So, unlike many other social and political battles in nonviolent action, we have a process of transformation of the individual and the society. And as a result, for somebody like Gandhi, for somebody like King, and many others, many other adherents of principle of nonviolence, politics is no more about the quest for power, but it is the quest for ethics in public life. A few years ago, I wrote a piece in the Hindu, and I said if Gandhi was alive today, he would not go to any Indian party politics. He would not vote for any candidate in any Indian election. Because Gandhi all his life, and that's why he left the Congress party after the independence. Gandhi didn't want to be part of the party politics. He didn't believe in party politics. And actually, again, party politics around the world is not the true politics which is changing the world. Look at yourself. I mean, some of you who are activists of the civil societies in your countries and in your regions, civic actors actually are changing the world. They are the ones who are fighting against hunger. They are the ones who are fighting for ecology. They are the ones who are fighting against violence against women, violence against children, child slavery, just name it. If you go to the Sub-Commission of Human Rights at the United Nations, I've been there, the states have nothing to say. All the projects and all the good projects are done by European, Asian, African, very rarely American, but yes, also some American NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and not the states. Because the states, they don't waste their time, they don't waste their money, they don't want to waste their money for that. So if this is the case, then the ontological argument would be that there is no separation between the self and the other. The other is an integral part of who I am. So in such an action, there is no place for selfishness, and selfishness is to cause suffering to others. Let me go a little bit quicker and try to finish in 5 minutes because I'm sure that you're tired also. The key points that I'm trying to make after Gandhi and King and all the practitioners of nonviolent democratic theory is that any act of social dissent and civil resistance should be an act of conscience. In other words, we have here continuity between the obligation to disobey, which is actually the title of one of my books, which I wrote for the Catalonia's actually independence movement. The obligation to disobey an unjust law, and the moral and spiritual transformation of dissenting individuals. So, some of the words that you need to practice and to work on your writings more often is obligation to disobey and dissent. Because dissenting is also a form of nonviolent thinking. Right? Dissent is very important. We have to consider ourselves as dissenters, not just activists, dissenters. Because dissenter is, in a Socratic way, is somebody who's thinking and asking new questions about himself and others, about herself and others. So I think we do not need to meditate a little, we do need to meditate a little more on this idea of moral obligation to disobey against unjust laws. And I would add to this that there is a need to introduce a new approach to civil disobedience. You remember, by the way, for those of you who know a little bit of Latin, who have done a little bit of history of religions, and you know a little bit more about Christianity, you know that St. Augustine actually is the person who gave this famous quote that is repeated by Martin Luther King Jr. also many times: an unjust law is no law at all. An unjust law is no law at all. So it shows that why we have an obligation to disobey. We have an obligation, moral obligation, to disobey something which is unjust, which is an unjust law. It could be at a university. It could be an unjust law practiced by a student, by a professor, by a vice chancellor, by anyone. But we have the moral obligation to disobey it in the same way that we have the moral obligation to stop the killing of animals, the destruction of the plants, because it's also unjust law. So this moral responsibility to respond to a situation where individual existence is increasingly suffocated either by an unjust law or by an apathetic legality which develops a sense of conformity and complacency. Now, in most of my writings, actually, I attack complacency and conformism as two ills and diseases of our world in 21st century. In our education, in our politics, in our manner of living, these two actually show themselves everywhere, especially with the reign of money and power. They are everywhere. We are becoming, as humanity, we're becoming more and more conformist. Not to say cowards. We are becoming very conformist, but we're becoming also complacent. Because we follow states and politicians who are actually degrading our moral dignity as human beings. So we have to be very careful of this. This was not the case, actually. If you go and read, for example, Americans in the American Revolution, like the Federalists, Hamilton, John Adams, they always talk about civic virtue. They say citizens cannot exist without civic virtue. Now, show me a citizen in today's world, anywhere, with the civic virtue, who is educated in a university like this by civic virtue, which is the most important, actually, which comes first. So, what follows from this is the conclusion that Violence has nothing to do with the real basis of our common goal, which is the political. And with this in mind, the original experience of lawmaking is not in Roman terms of command and obedience, but in the Greek sense of constructing a space for freedom. Civil disobedience, therefore, determines the individual and the public in a polity, preserving a political community as a dynamic res publica. Nonviolent disobedience, therefore, implies dissent. I underline dissent, and is a hallmark of free questioning. So that's where my Socrates comes in. Socratic questioning, why things are as they are. And this is where I think that we have the practice of dissent, which becomes very, very important. So to end, I would say the problem of legitimacy of the law and justice is not related to the question of who rules, but it is an ongoing search for autonomy and critical questioning. And in this sense, in a democratic society, citizens contribute collectively to the making of the laws. If they contribute to the making of the laws, they can put into question the laws also. But they have to think of themselves as people who contribute. We are more and more alienated from the state and more alienated from any form of legislation, because a bunch of stupid people who are working for different states, they come and tell us, no, we are the lawmakers. You are not the lawmakers. Lawmakers at the global level, lawmakers at the regional and local levels are the citizens, not the people who are working, not the functionaries of the states. With that, we have to understand. Otherwise, we cannot change anything. And this is where what I call the nonviolent democratic theory has its strength, actually. So the philosophy of nonviolent civil resistance is also a philosophy of dissent. It is a moment of democratic pedagogy with which at Whole Street Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, Martin Luther King talked about. And I want you to quote this. Go and read Martin Luther King. He's a great thinker. He says, we are here because of our love for democracy, because of our deep-seated belief that democracy transformed from thin paper to thick action is the greatest form of government on earth. But to be so, it should be transformed from thin paper to thick action, meaning the action of the citizens, and not just a piece of paper that you call the Constitution or something like legality. So Dr. King's majestic speech is a reminder to us today of how important democracy is, not only as a constitutional regime, but as a way of dissent for those fighting for their rights and for justice. More than being a world of conformity and complacency, democracy as it is fought and practiced by nonviolent democratic theory is a world of solidarity and interconnection. Solidarity and interconnectedness. Solidarity and what King calls, and this is for the people who work on ecology, cosmic companionship. Beautiful concept by Martin Luther King. Cosmic companionship. This is for the German sitting. Maybe you know it. And if you don't know it, go and read Martin Luther King in English or in German. As such, nonviolence is primarily a mode of associated living and communicated experience, an experience of communication. And as a matter of fact, if we disobey unjust laws, it is not because we want to fight democracy, but to expand democracy, to enlarge pluralism, to what I call democratize democracies. So essentially, democracy is not only about political parties. It's not only about active voting, as Rousseau made fun of the British in the Contrat Social and said, well, they think that they're free because they go and vote every 7 years or every 4 years. This is not the case. We should not only be free every 5 years in India or every 7 years in France or now it's 5 years in France also, or every 4 years in the United States. But it's not about the act of voting, it's about the moral and political maturity of citizens like us. Moral maturity of students, citizens of today, citizens of tomorrow, here sitting. And it's about nonviolent theory of dissent. So, as we can see in our societies, this moral and political maturity is totally absent, as what I was saying, because when we are thinking in terms of nonviolent dissent, we need to think and to act in terms of critical disobedience, which is the blueprint for a new space of autonomy and non-demagogic politics. So let me conclude by saying that we need to be actually conscious of the fact that the practice of nonviolent dissent in the form of civil resistance against authoritarianism is a form of political paideia, as the Greeks used to say, which requires a permanent practice of critical self-examination and art of questioning. This critical self-examination is what separates successful nonviolent movements, as those of Gandhi, as those of Martin Luther King, from what we saw in the Arab Spring. Arab Spring was not successful because this questioning was not there, actually. I think that undoubtedly in a world like ours, where the grammar of life is limited by the vocabularies of consumerism, utilitarianism, behaviorism, corporatism, and these concepts that I'm talking about, concepts like dissent or nonviolence, no longer find a place in our everyday conversation. And that's a big problem. Meanwhile, some of us continue to believe that without dissent, without disobedience, human beings cannot be fully free, and that nonviolent resistance to injustice and authoritarianism, or even to meaninglessness, is an ideal of excellence and nobility of spirit. Thank you very much.